now Yeshua turns to the Pharisees and does to them what they thought they had done to him. He puts them on the spot. They were trying to get him in some kind of a Moses trap. But in the book of Deuteronomy, the texts are central to the Jewish people. They know the book of Deuteronomy. That's where the Shema is, for heaven's sake. And there are several key moments where Moses gets everybody present to assent to what he's teaching to them. Well, two of these are very well-known passages. Deuteronomy 11, which repeats the Shema. Look at this one, Deuteronomy 11, 1 through 4. He says, therefore, you will love the Lord your God, keep his charge and his statutes and his judgments and his commandments always, and know you this day, for I speak not with your children which have not known these things, or which have not seen the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and what else? His stretched out arm, his miracles, his acts that he did in the middle of Egypt even, to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all this land. And what he did to the army of Egypt, to their horses and chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea overflow them when they pursued after you, and how the Lord has destroyed them to this day. Now, how many of you know every year when the Jews do Passover, they read the story of Egypt and Pharaoh and them leaving, crossing the Red Sea? That's what the whole Passover Seder is about, that they've been doing every year. Now, here we go. Are you ready? We're going to go through these kind of fast. Exodus 9:22. What do they read every Passover? The Lord said to Moses to do what? Stretch forth your hand toward heaven that there may be hail. Exodus 10:12. And the Lord said to Moses what? Okay, we'll try it one more time. Exodus 10:21. And the Lord said to Moses what? All right, we're getting it. And there was darkness repeatedly. Now look at Exodus 14:15 through 17. And the Lord said to Moses, why are you whining to me? Speak to the children of Israel that they go forward, lift up your rod and do what? Stretch out your hand. And then he says, I will harden the hearts of all the Egyptians, and they'll follow them, and I'll give me honor on Pharaoh and all of his host and his chariots and his horsemen. Now let's go to the next verse in 21 of Exodus 14. So what did Moses do? Stretched out his hand over the sea. Okay, can you get the idea? All right. Now, let's look at Exodus 14, 26 and 27. And the Lord said to Moses, what? Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come again on the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on the horsemen. And so what did Moses do? Stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned, and all the Egyptians fled, and all the Egyptians died. Every Jew knows these verses. They have it memorized. It's been 1,500 years, for heaven's sake, since this event happened for them. Well, guess what? That happened on a Sabbath. It was on a Sabbath that they left Egypt. And the first Passover is Nisan 14. Nisan 15, the first day of unleavened bread, is a Sabbath. That's when they packed up their bags and they traveled far more than a Sabbath day journey. So what is Yeshua telling them? Moses allowed them to pick up their bags and get the heck out of Egypt. And 7 days later, on another Sabbath, the last day of the Feast of Leavened Bread, is when all of the Red Sea covers them. So he's saying, look, you guys, you're trying to trap me with Moses. Moses is the one who said you could travel on the Sabbath and had a great victory. And he said, Moses is the one who said you could cross the Red Sea on the Sabbath. So he's saying, why are you telling me that I can't heal one person on the Sabbath? He wasn't doing away with the Sabbath. He was reinforcing it because they didn't understand the Sabbath. That's why I've said earlier, the priests who's supposed to know me don't even know my law. They were clueless. Okay. Now, I just got done reading how God said he would harden the hearts of all the Egyptians, right? Okay. Now, Yeshua has them in a quandary because that's why they shut up. They don't know how to respond. They know exactly what he's saying. For them, Moses was someone who they might use against Jesus, but now he's offered them the real Moses. Okay? Insinuating that the real Moses is totally against their imagined Moses in a way that's perfectly clear to them. The problem is, those Jews were following a replacement theology that imagined a Moses of their own liking. There was replacement theology back then. They were thinking of God not as he really is. They were presenting God as some harsh. I mean, I was raised Catholic, and I always saw God as throwing lightning bolts at the people down below. You know, he was out there, get us. But that's not who God is. And so replacement theology is even within the Jewish people. They're trying to, and just like we do, we try to create God in our image rather than realizing we're created in his image. But look at this. Yeshua was grieved because of the hardness of their heart. So when we read these verses, we need to connect it back to the original story. So what is happening? The man with the withered hand becomes Moses, and Yeshua tells him to do what? Stretch forth your hand. And then he's angry because of the hardness of their heart. Yeshua becomes Yahweh, God, who is telling the withered man. So they're totally upset at Yeshua because he's taking on the role of God, telling the man with the withered hand that you're Moses and stretch forth your hand, and they become the hard-hearted Egyptians who don't want him healed. But unless you understand the connections of the phrases, you miss the whole connection of what's really going on and why they wanted to kill him. Isn't that fascinating? So now Yahweh's evil because Yahweh freed everybody on the Sabbath? You can see how they caught him in a total trap, but it's because of their imagination of a different Moses than the real Moses. And that's what many Christians also do today. But what's amazing, according to forever, the leaving Egypt happened on the first day of unleavened bread. That's a Sabbath. The crossing of the Red Sea happened on the seventh day of unleavened bread, which is a Sabbath. So a lot of it is just a misunderstanding. Okay, so now, again, the question is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? God says, I do both. I save you and I destroy them. They're both good. But my question is, what do you choose? Do we want to be a hard-hearted Egyptian? Or do we want to be a God-fearing believer? Okay, so that brings me to another story. You can see how if you know that when you're reading the Gospels, everything comes to life. It's a whole different idea when you connect the dots. This is one of my other absolutely favorite stories. Okay, you can see the map here. You can see the Sea of Galilee. You can see Capernaum up at the top. And then I want you to look toward the bottom where these two red stars are. You see Mount Moreh. Now, Moreh in the Hebrew means teacher. Okay, Yeshua was the teacher, the Moreh. But you see Shunem right there? Okay, up here's Capernaum. And then here's Nain. You notice Nain is right next to Shunem? Two miracles occurred in the Bible. One of them happened in Shunem. The other one happened in Nain. As we read the story, we're going to find out Yeshua was in Capernaum, and then he heads down to Nain. But before we do that, we're going to go and connect the dot to something in the Tanakh. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. It fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem. So now you know where Shunem is, and that's where Elisha went, where was a great woman, and she constrained Elisha to eat bread. And so it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat bread. Well, what happens in the story in verse 14 through 17, Gehazi, who was Elisha's servant, answered and said to Elisha, she has no child. Her husband is old. And so Elisha said, well, call her. And when he had called her, she stood at the door, and he said, about this season, according to the time of life, you're going to have a son. And she said, no way, my Lord, you man of God, don't you lie to me. Okay. And the woman ended up conceiving and bare a son at that season that Elisha said unto her, according to the time of life. Now, one thing you may not have heard, but I believe in Jewish history, this was Jonah. That's who she gave birth to. It was Jonah. But anyway, aside from that, that happened in Shunem. Well, guess what? How many of you know little towns know everything that goes on? All right. Let's go to Luke 7, 1 and 2. Yeshua had finished speaking in the hearing of all the people. He entered into where? Capernaum. And we're going to go there in a few months. We're going to be there. A certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and at the point of death. Everyone know that story, right? Well, look at this. In Luke 7, 11 and 12. It came to pass the day after, he went into a city called Nain. Now we know in Shunem, miracle happened with Elijah and a child was born. Now let's look what happens. He went into the city called Nain, and how many of his disciples went with him? Many. Could have been 1,000 or something. I mean, many of his disciples were following him. It says went with him and much people. So we're talking about a lot. And when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man being carried out, the only son of his mother. Remember in the story in Elisha, the kid ends up dying and Elisha has to go back and resurrect him back to life, laying on him 3 times. Remember that? So here a child was raised from the dead in Shunem. Well, now here in Nain, the same thing. A son, the only one of his mother, is dead and being carried out. And it says she was a widow. And how many people was with her? Much people were with her. Okay, so now here comes the story. How many of you, when you grew up, I don't know how it is in other nations. We have many nations right here in the house. But how many of you, whenever a funeral was going by, everyone's car stopped? Every car stopped, let the funeral procession go by. That was protocol, right? That comes from Judaism of 2,000 years ago. Whenever a funeral procession was taking place, the women would always be in the front, and then you would have the men and the children, and at the very end was the funeral bier carrying the dead person, and they're leaving the gate of the city because you can't have dead people in the city. The cemetery was always outside of the city limits, and they would carry. And back then, what would happen, whenever people were coming into a town, if there was a funeral procession going on, they would all stop, and they wouldn't enter the town, walking until the funeral procession went by. So that was history. Okay, well, here's the thing. The Jews were always into protocol. I mean, that's why they make good lawyers. They were always into what's right. Well, guess what? The Jews asked, oh my goodness, what do we do if there's a funeral procession and all of a sudden on the street comes a wedding procession? Who's supposed to stop? This happens. And they decided the wedding procession has the priority because it's about life and not death. And then they said, oh my goodness, what happens if there's a wedding procession and a funeral procession and a procession of the King of Israel? Who has to stop? Okay, so here we go. Here comes the funeral procession. Here comes the wedding procession. The funeral procession has to stop. Here comes the King of Israel. The wedding procession has to stop because the King of Israel always has the priority. Now think about this for a minute when you go back to the story. Here we have many people, it says, that are coming into the city with Yeshua. A gate is a narrow gate of the city. And many people are leaving the city with the funeral procession. There's this big clash of customs. Who is going to stop? Is the wedding procession supposed to stop? Is the Yeshua? Do they recognize him as the King of Israel? Are they going to stop? Is Yeshua going to break protocol and say, let the funeral procession go, I'm backing off? Or is he going to say, I'm the King of Israel and you guys stop? You don't see that. Unless you know the culture, you don't realize that when it says many people were with him and many people are leaving the city and it's all at the same time, you don't make these connections. Well, listen to Luke 7, 13 and 14. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and those that bore him, what did they do? The whole procession stops for the King of Israel. This is a verse that proves Yeshua in another, according to the culture and custom, is the King of Israel. And so he keeps moving from the beginning of the funeral procession all the way to the end, and everyone is standing still for him. And then what does he do? It says, young man, arise, and he that was dead sat up and began to speak. But if you don't understand the Jewish protocol, you miss the whole story that really what this is saying is that Yeshua is the king of Israel, and they had to stop for him. Crazy, huh? Isn't this fun? So we'll look at this more next week.